All right, I'm going to, this session that we're going to have here is going to be a one-man show, so to speak, and we've asked Doug Robinson, who's the Executive Director of the National Association of State CIOs, which is a boutique national organization like our own. He has 53 members, and of course that's a dynamic membership, isn't it, when elections roll around, for the state CIOs that work with his organizations. They provide state CIOs and state members with products and services designed to support the challenging role of the state CIO and stimulate the exchange of information and promote the adoption of IT best practices and innovations. And Doug is a frequent speaker, panelist, author. He's a national expert, recognized as such for state CIOs and policy issues. Many of you may remember Doug in 2014 joined us in St. Petersburg when we had the FOI summit there. And I was looking back on that topic, and your topic then was open government versus open data. I think we're going to ratchet it up a little bit above that today based on conversations that Doug and I had about this. I've known Doug for many years. I won't mention how many, but we go back a long ways, and I've really enjoyed watching, and he's been a great mentor and always has time to share information. And I think he got a lot of feedback from the coalitions when he was here in 2014 for what he had to offer. And so let me introduce today, this morning, Doug Robinson, National Association of State CIOs. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all. I'm covered here, 2 microphones here, so I have to balance all this as I speak. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. Beautiful location. It's nice to be here in Dallas. I travel the country. I've already been in 3 major conferences this April, as well as 1 more to go. So a common part of my practice is to get to fly with my best girlfriend, Delta. I see her a lot. So anyway, let me talk a little bit about the association, and I really am going to talk a little bit about certainly what's going on in the states from a cybersecurity standpoint and cover some of that. But I did want to provide a little bit of background. As Dan mentioned, even harder? Okay. Okay, how about this? Is this good? Better? Dial it up. Okay. Like Beyonce, I have to, okay. My background has spent many years in state government, and back going into the early to mid 90s, I was involved in actually rewriting and amending a state's Open Records Act to include the access to electronic records. So, my personal experience is actually in the trenches on the state government side, working through this, as well as leading the portfolio for electronic government in the state and bringing the first online website and the first online transaction where state citizens could actually transact business and pay for hunting and fishing licenses and things like that. So this is where I've been into the practice side, and for the last 15 years leading the National Association. I have a passion for state IT and certainly the open government and good government agenda, but I don't have to actually do anything anymore, which is good. I just get to talk about it, so it's really nice. This is our association. Been around for 50 years. I have not been there 50 years, but we are a legacy system. 1969, a group of folks probably smaller than this gathered in Denver under the National Association of State Information Systems. A lot of guys with short white sleeve shirts, pocket protectors, and they talked about Fortran and their new IBM 9070. So that is the evolution of this organization to now a state IT leadership organization. As Dan mentioned, we have 53 members. All the states, 2 territories, and the District of Columbia. These are all the states and territories that have a chief information officer. These folks are all appointees today. They are all appointed by the governor as the highest ranking state IT official in the executive branch. That's our area of responsibility, is executive branch only. So we'll talk a little bit about that and our relationship with the other branches of government, because most of the frustrations I think that you all have emanate from the legislative branch. And I'm not going to disclaim that we don't have a responsibility, but again, state CIOs don't have responsibility as the custodian of public records. They provide the technology framework, and so we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges. NASCIO has long-term been an advocate for open government. We have written guides and theses and reports and studies starting, I think, as early as 2001. Put out a guide to open government and digital government, which included sections around citizen access to government. We encourage that. NASCIO petitioned the General Services Administration in 2001 for the .gov domain. And I think, as you know today, that's the predominant platform that is used by all states. All states use the .gov domain. It's very special to have that special place in heaven for states. We petitioned the GSA, wrote a brief on that, and asked for local governments as well. I encourage all states and local governments to continue to use that, and we continue to talk about the additional security measures that need to go into effect. And so there's some changes coming up to that based on federal government policy that we'll get into if you have any questions. But again, I think the .gov domain is a simple and similar and same nomenclature that all states continue to use, and we like to expand that even. 2002, we put out a major call to information security around states. 2008, I wrote an issue brief around the challenges around electronic records and electronic access for state CIOs, because they are, quite frankly, caught in the middle in some of these discussions around access to public records and the definitions around that. We've continued this advocacy. 2009, which I think I mentioned in Petersburg, we put out the first call to action, which was around government open data, and put out a pretty extensive research brief describing what states should do. At that point, we had 3 states that actually had an open data portal, 3 states that had an open data portal. 5 years later, we did a retrospective, and we were up to 38 states that had a .gov portal where they actually provided machine-readable open data. We want to continue to encourage that, as well as have broader access to public records, and I'm encouraged to see more states and local governments moving to online portals for public records. That should be easy to obtain those records. And again, I think most importantly, we continue this conversation with our friends both at the Electronic Records Working Group, but also with COSA, with the Council of State Archivists. And last, I think, May or so, June, we issued a new playbook. It was co-authored by NASCIO and COSA around dealing with electronic records in the digital age, and particularly long-term digital preservation and what's going on in that space. So anyway, that's us, and we're going to kind of cover some of these topics. I'm going to really do a play in kind of 4 acts. No intermission, so you don't get to get up. But 4 acts. One is cover a general overall IT landscape very quickly. I want to talk about what's going on, because these forces of change all have implications for what happens in the future around the issues that you are concerned about, particularly the changes to the business models. I'm going to talk certainly more extensively about the why, cybersecurity, and the rationale behind what you've seen is increasing numbers of exemptions being developed by state legislators and issued, obviously codified in law around increasing number of exemptions driven by Homeland Security, anti-terrorism, but particularly by cybersecurity threats. So I'll kind of go through some of the numbers and talk about the rationale and what's going on in the states and some of the changes that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years around those external cybersecurity threats and how the states have to respond to that and some of the issues. I think one of the things I will say, and Dan and I had this conversation, is my role here is not to it's not a disclaimer, but I'm not here to defend the states. I have my own personal opinions about open government. I'm here to describe to you the environment of the states and some of the rationale behind this, because again, most of these exemptions and protections are driven by what state officials believe to be as rational business reasons for doing this, but clearly there is some overreaction in some states. And I'm not, the genesis of that, you all probably know better than us, but there's obviously other groups that want to constrain that. And we are certainly, as the association, have always been a longtime advocate for government that is more open. But again, the state CIOs, despite their title of Chief Information Officers, their responsibility is really in the technology stack. They are not the custodians of the public records. They manage those on behalf of their agency customers. So we'll talk about that so you know the difference. Just a quick overview of these are the major themes This is really, I'm giving you the end of the story. The epilogue is right here. This is the end of what we're seeing in terms of, number one, about IT leadership in the states. Again, as I pointed to you, the governors appoint their state CIOs, 22 new governors in November. We have 15 new state CIOs as of last week. Actually, as of last week, the new CIO in Maine started April 1st. And so this is a very dynamic set of changes that take place on a regular basis. In the last year, from April 1 of 18 to today, we've had 25 new state CIOs. So my primary responsibility at NASCIO is make new friends fast, because their median tenure right now is close to 22 months. So this is part of the challenges that we have about managing technology in state governments, is this constant churn. Then you can see the maturity of the states where the CIOs have been around for a long time. What I'm going to talk about today is really the second point, which is about what's going on in the cybersecurity space. What are the major themes? What are the major trends, particularly around the changing aspects of the external threats, and also, what investments are being made. And the most important thing today that you should understand is that there is clearly a cybersecurity crisis when it comes to the workforce in state government. States cannot retain their current talent. They can't recruit new talent. In this space, there's negative unemployment. If you're an information security professional today and you have the requisite experience and certificates, you can cash in. And that's not without fail. If you have any children or folks that you want to encourage to move into this space, I would tell them to move it, because it is a very lucrative area right now in terms of the economy, is cybersecurity, as you can imagine. And we're going to talk a little bit about these other activities, particularly the changing nature of the CIO business model and why this impacts what you're talking about. You've already seen some examples, and I'm going to connect the dots to you this morning about what's going on in the software as a service or X as a service platforms, cloud services, and why you're going to see this evolving set of business models and capabilities from the private partners. You're going to see more of it in state government. It's already growing pretty dramatically. You're going to see more. Just a quick heat map so you can visualize. Look at your state. That's the state CIO transitions. All those in green have occurred since January 1 of 2019. You see the other ones through 18. So we've got a couple of folks in there, people like Georgia and Connecticut, that have around almost 8 years. So it's very unusual. The most unusual thing about this, that if you're in our business you would discern, is that we had 7 gubernatorial flips in terms of parties from R to D. And what was fascinating for us in 19 is we had 4 incumbent CIOs get reappointed. So those that had served under a Republican governor, some for almost 8 years, were actually reappointed by the new governor. Highly unusual, highly unusual. Very surprised to see that. It almost never happens. Most of our turn is around 90+%. 2010, we had 31 new governors elected, and in 2011, we ended up with 27 new CIOs. All the parties that changed resulted in a new state CIO. So that's the challenge we have, is continuing to educate that group. Probably the most important slide just to look at, because it kind of encapsulates what's going on in the states. Each year we do an online ballot. We've done 2006, we've asked our state CIOs to actually say, what is your top 10 management priority or strategy for the upcoming year? Prognosticate for the next year, next calendar year, and tell us what's going to be on your heart and mind. What are you going to invest in? What's going to be your major areas of strategy for leadership? And we take that, homogenize that, put it in the NASCIO blender, we come out with a national top 10 for state CIOs. So this is really our major message to the marketplace that helps our executive committee, our governance group, and our board look at what they're going to invest in, and it also helps in terms of the committee structure and what are the topics we're going to research and publish on, because we do publish a lot of reports every single year. These are the top ones. You can see security, risk management, number 1. It has been number 1 for 6 straight years. It's been on the list since 2006, but number 1. And you will see digital government up there. You will see data analytics, data management and analytics up there. These are consistently in the top 10. They will shift around a little bit in the bottom tiers. We'll see some folks come on, like Agile and Iterative Development was on for a couple of years. It dropped into number 11, and Identity and Access Management moved up. Again, a key component of serving digital government to citizens is some type of enterprise identity and management, some type of authentication and credentialing so that citizens can have that Amazon-like experience across state government. and having one universal credential across state government. That doesn't exist today, but we have states that are building those capabilities as we speak. So that's exciting to see across the states. So again, state top 10, very important. What's also shifted is in terms of the priorities of the state CIOs over the last several years. For many, many years, when state CIOs were asked this question, what's their top priority or goal as a state CIO? It would be to create and drive a strategy through execution, through overall state objectives. So aligning with the governor's policy agenda, what are we going to do to deliver value, efficiency, effective, and secure government? And that would be the top one. The last couple of years, what's happened is that state CIOs realized what area they ignore at their peril is cybersecurity and risk reduction. So you can see at 64%, that's kind of their major thread today, is making sure that their systems comply with regulations and that they've met their audit controls, and really, again, to secure the environment and reduce the risk across all of the executive branch. So that's really important. So let's dive into cybersecurity for a few moments, because I really want you to understand what's going on in the environment today. So this is just simply not all cybersecurity risks, but a good encapsulation of both what I'll call the hard target risks as well as some of the challenges from an internal perspective. I think first and foremost, states today are really not effectively organized, and by that I mean as an enterprise level, with few exceptions. So they're not as mature and organized to deal with the massive number of threats. In fact, very few organizations are. Very few organizations are in terms of that capability. So again, we're talking about maturity and the ability to essentially defend against both internal and external malicious acts. It's really challenging, and part of that is simply the nature of the threats and the evolution that we're seeing. Part of the state's challenge is they have a massive amount of legacy systems. They are inherently open, unlike private companies. They have an inherently open posture. Their networks and others have to be constantly protected. Phishing, ransomware, hacktivism, terms you've probably heard. There's a dramatic increase in the last 3 years, 5-fold increase in phishing attacks. Those are usually with malware-laden software coming in the email system. Email has basically become the payload for bad actors to get into state government. And this has happened on a regular basis. It continues to hack, including, I think, the most latest iterations of this around ransomware. We've seen, if you've followed this at all in the press, you've seen multiple examples over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly with the cities and with counties, with local utilities, and also with large nation states, the British healthcare system, all being subject to ransomware attack. That's where the essentially criminal and bad actors, these are usually criminal organizations, lock up your data, and you must pay to get it ransomed through Bitcoin. And again, this could be expensive, $400,000 or $500,000. This has become the preferred vector today for monetizing criminal activities in the cybersecurity space, because the theft of data has become less attractive. The theft of data has become less attractive. The criminal actors, particularly Eastern European, South American, Asia Pacific, there's so much data that has now been stolen. Your data, my data, you've all got those letters from Home Depot and Anthem and from Target and from everybody else, that the cost per unit of that data has gone down to make it not as effective as actually ransomware. So the FBI has reported high ransomware. A related and corollary piece of that, and something that is certainly interesting to you all, is the hacktivism, which is the civic disobedience using, again, cybersecurity measures, particularly things like DDoS, people understand denial of service attacks. We've seen that happen. This is groups like Anonymous, and they have attacked many states and many local governments. They do this for sport. They don't do it to monetize anything. They're not stealing data. They're simply taking government offline. It's about the continuity of government. We've seen, if you think about some of the civil disobedience things that we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years, the riots in Baltimore, the Flint water crisis, these have all been accompanied by hacktivism attacks, where they've taken down state, local websites and simply locked up because they're trying to send a message. This has also been accompanied by things called doxing, which doxing is document tracing. We've seen a lot of this where, again, groups like Anonymous and others have gone after public officials by, again, exposing private documents. So in many cases, they put out names and addresses of the chief of police and other state officials. They find these private individuals' information and they put it out, and that's called doxing. We see a lot of that. We see, again, increases in whaling, and whaling is a term which directs high-ranking officials. It's targeted at, again, political officials, it's targeted elected officials. I've had several whaling attempts from my staff where they're receiving email telling them that I've directed them to move $10,000 from one account to another account. We've seen $10,000, we've seen $100,000. There have been many companies where the CEO has been the victim of whaling because someone's directed the chief financial officer to move $100,000 to order this product from a bogus company. And now once that money's gone, it's gone. So again, these attacks and these cybersecurity incidents are becoming more sophisticated. And we have other acts, you see some of the other things up there, particularly around, you've seen plenty of incidents of the foreign espionage, particularly from the Chinese. That's happened on almost a daily basis. So now it's getting into the government space. So again, all these plates are spinning simultaneously, and I think that's very, very important. This is the major risk to state governments today. Their employees and third-party contractors. Dave is a perfectly good state employee, probably one of your employees, probably part of your organization. So despite all the technology investments, the major risk that most state organizations, in fact, the major risk that all organizations have to deal with is their employees. So if we could get away with not having humans in the workforce, we'd probably be much safer. A high number of risks are associated with the human element being introduced with the use of technology and networks and mobile devices and everything else. You have a password. If you look at the top 5 remediations in cyber hygiene, if we could eliminate all of those, we would probably eliminate about 85 to 90% of the incidents we have today because they involve weak passwords, password being compromised, too much privileged access to systems where people don't have legitimate reasons to have access to those systems. So there's a number of cyber hygiene efforts that have yet to be proliferated across organizations. And that's when I say they're not mature enough yet. When you get to that state, you would be able to eliminate a lot of these instances. So again, Dave is a big problem in most organizations. Dave's a big problem. So this is what states care about when you're talking about cybersecurity. There's a whole set of risks, and they have to balance those risks with, again, protecting privacy and access to open government. They have, obviously, financial risk. They have reputational risk. They do not want to break the citizen trust. They have to deal with financial risk in terms of the loss of revenue. They have to deal with the cost of breach, the breach notifications. We now have about close to 40% of the states now have cybersecurity liability insurance. So that's going to help them on the financial side with the breaches. So that's important. So again, they want to continue to deliver services to citizens, but they also know that in an increasingly digital world, and their desire to deliver more services and deliver essentially more value to citizens, and do that increasingly, if you look at this, where the states are going, their government is delivered in a 3x4 inch piece of glass that's in your hand. Mobile services the adoption of that have become significant, and that's the way they would like to deliver. Again, that introduces more security challenges. So what we're going to see in the future is the issuance of things like digital credentials in a mobile area. We now have 3 states, I believe, that are piloting digital driver's license. So your future driver's license may be on your iPhone. So I think that's what states would like to do. So they have lots of aspirations. Quite frankly, I can tell you I don't believe they've delivered on the promise. When I go back and read our 2001 guide to digital government and our call to action, I don't believe states have delivered on the promise of that, but it's not because of technology. Part of it is this balance of the security risks that have now become more prevalent that weren't really considered. When I go back and look at that, there was hardly any mention of the overarching security concerns, because now they've become so aggressive, and so I guess the velocity of these things and the volume of these things have become dramatic, and so that's a big issue for the states. But that's not something in 2001 we were spending a lot of time talking about in terms of digital government. Other than we wanted the transaction to be secure, we weren't thinking about the external threats to those transactions. So that's a challenge I have to deal with today. So let's talk a little bit before I end on cyber about what's going on in this space. Each biennium, we partner with Deloitte. We have since 2010, so we have some good longitudinal data. We do a very large study of cybersecurity in the states. It's a states at risk theories. I think it's probably the preeminent report on state government cybersecurity, and we publish almost all the data. There's some of it we cannot publish because it involves security risk to the states. But we do publish almost all the aggregate data in this report. This report is available to you all. It is freely available on the NASCIO website. And so we look at this, we have this data from 2010. So what have we seen in looking at that? We've seen the discussion shift, as you can see, from more discussion around ransomware, around social engineering, around phishing, farming, and those other variants I talked about, like whaling. And so what do we mean by things like social engineering? Again, that's highly sophisticated use of kind of behavioral ways to get employees, particularly in state government, to expose their credentials, their passwords, and other personally identifiable information. And it's easily done. If it's well orchestrated, and you see plenty of examples where it's done, you have all been, I suspect, victims of some time, or at least exposed to some type of phishing attack where the actual sender was something other than the actual sender. So it came from some other cybersecurity risk, and you didn't see that at first. And this is commonplace in state government when you have tens of thousands of employees. The state of California has 220,000 employees. It's very easy to mount a phishing attack using social engineering. January of 2018, about 5 states were fortunately not major victims, but they were victims of a highly sophisticated social engineering and phishing attack, where the bad actors sent an email to thousands of state employees, targeted, saying your W-2 is now available electronically. This was about a week before they would normally get this information. So again, using the behavioral influence of I'd like to get my W-2 early, they sent 2,500 employees in Connecticut an email and said, click on this link and put in this information and we'll give you access. Again, the email looked identical to the design and the language and the nomenclature of an email that would come from the state. The links all looked good, but in fact the link sent them off to a middleware piece where they asked to put in their name and their email and their social security number. And about several hundred people did that. Some people at one point said, this doesn't seem right, and they stopped, which was good. Several people reported it to the cybersecurity head. That was good. But there were a few that clicked on that link. They were immediately taken to the Department of Finance portal, so that was legitimate. So simply a man-in-the-middle attack which captured that information and was harvesting that. So again, they did that. They were stopped, fortunately, within minutes because someone reported it. That afternoon at 3 p.m., they launched another attack on the same state, simultaneously other states. Very different looking. But again, that's the type of thing that's happening day after day. So this is challenging. I would say if you look at a middle-sized state, they're getting 6 to 8 million network probes a day. 6 to 8 million a day. So that's some bad actor looking for a vulnerability, a configuration, a password on a server that's incorrect. So this is 24/7 they're operating this. So this is the challenge. This is the other challenge that I mentioned around hacktivism and what I would call, so raise it above the cyber incident, which is the common threat vector for many, many years, or criminals who are trying to steal data from state government. 2012 stole 3.6 million records from the Tax and Revenue Department of the state of South Carolina. Business and individual tax records. Credit card numbers where individuals had used their credit card to pay for their tax liability. 33 different systems compromised, all by one very well-developed, executed phishing attack on system administrators. That was a cyber incident resulting in a significantly major financial, political risk, a reputational risk, but also I think right now about $35 million and counting to the state of South Carolina. Plus the fact that 3.6 million citizens lost their personal information that you put on your tax return for the state government. So again, not a good look for the state. It's happened many times in other states, not to that magnitude, but it continues to happen in the public sector. What we've seen where the game has changed a little bit is now it's into cyber disruption, which is again impacting the continuity of government, where it's these outside bad actors are targeting state and local governments and the federal government to be able to disrupt the continuity of government and send a political statement. So that's different because now they're going after the healthcare system, they're going after the utility system, they're going after infrastructure. And so, NASCIO is not a group that is high on paranoia, right? I mean, we don't have the chicken little sky is falling discussion. We're looking at how do states respond, how do they recover, how are they resilient, and part of this is planning for cyber disruption. So 3 years ago we issued a planning guide which walks state through this process of cybersecurity is not about information technology, it's a business problem, it's a business risk that states have to address, and it also requires team sport. So I give you all this background because this is the internal conversations that are taking place every day in the states. Every state has a chief information security officer today. All but 2 report to the chief information officer, which is my group. So we have a very active CISO community that we work with. We actually have conferences for that group because they've become part of the C-suite and they've become one of the most important individuals in state government because they're dealing with this on a daily basis. Just to get a little more granular, I'm not going to get too technical here, but when you look at some of the applications, the web applications have become the most predominant risk in terms of security breaches. And when you look at this data right here and you see 19 states, these are the number of respondents out of 49. When you see my state has not been breached, 19, that's that they know of. I'm confident that every state has been breached. Every state has been breached. I tell governors that. Governors said, well, you don't have any cybersecurity issues. And I say, you do, you just don't know it yet. So there's been a breach in every state. Some cases it didn't result in the theft or loss of data. It simply was what I call criminal trespassing. Again, they are very sophisticated, and they're much more sophisticated than the defense mechanisms of the states, quite frankly, because they're doing this 24/7. They only have to get it right once. The state CIO's office, they have to get it right all the time. And again, without the requisite resources and the personnel commensurate with the level of risk. Commensurate with the level of risk. And across all of this, if you look at the data that we have from 2010, and I suspect, this is the first empirical data we started collecting, but I think even before that, this would have been the case. So 3 persistent challenges, one which, and again, they haven't changed since 2010. One is around lack of sufficient funding, inadequate funding around the space. You hear governments say this about everything, right? We don't have enough funding. The data would, if you look at our data, 2% of the state IT budget, 2% is dedicated to cybersecurity and risk reduction, not commensurate with the risk. The federal government this year is going to spend 16% of their IT budget, 16%. If you look at benchmarks in the private sector, these would be financial institutions, investor-owned utilities, insurance companies, other what I'll call process-driven, large organizations. They're spending between 7 and 10% on risk reduction. People like Citibank and Chase, we've met with them and talked to what are they spending. They're spending, again, a lot more to cover risks. And if you look at where states would look, or you put states in the Fortune 500 or Fortune 100, most states would fall in that if you look at the size of their budget. Today, states are spending about $50 billion a year on information technology, services, consulting, contracts, sources. Again, not spending nearly enough. The question is that money readily available in the states? It may be. It may be simply distributed and needs to be, again, brought together, harmonized, rationalized around what that spend is about. So that's what states are struggling with today, is nobody wants to pay more taxes. That is clearly the evidence that we're getting and the type of discussions that we're having in all state legislators. All those new tax initiatives, for the most part, are being pushed back, or at least reduced dramatically. And so states have to deal with the lack of investment in this space the best they can. Part of it is becoming more mature around the policy space and addressing those through some of the constraining mechanism that, in fact, you may not be particularly pleased with, and I've seen that. So that's one of the challenges that they have, is how to reduce the risk without spending the capital, as much as they can. Inadequate cybersecurity staffing, again, number 3 and 4, number 2 and 3, number 2 with the state CIOs, and number 2 with the state chief information security officers, and that is inadequate capabilities, but certainly inadequate compensation, inadequate staff. Part of that is simply because we're now in negative unemployment. There are many, many more information security positions available than there are qualified candidates. This is a crisis level at the states, where they cannot recruit and retain qualified. And again, we're not talking about a small organization. They need highly qualified cybersecurity professionals in an industrial strength environment with the magnitude of the threats are far greater than many private sector companies, simply because states are highly attractive targets. Why? They have critical infrastructure. They have all of the data, much more personally identifiable info data than local level or federal level. States have cradle-to-grave electronic records on all of us. They have the golden record of your identity, which is unfortunately your driver's license. It's not meant to be, but that's the breeder document. That your driver's license is the bedrock of your identity. Again, that transcends all of the things that you have to do, starts with your state driver's license. And so those are some of the challenges that we have to address, is how do you move through this. And again, increasing sophistication of threats already covered, and that's going to continue to morph. This is the challenge, is that this doesn't remain static. We've seen these changes even in the last 5 years, a dramatic uptick in things like ransomware and hacktivism that have to be addressed. And they become even more sophisticated as many of these tools are actually out there in the wild, and they're open source. They are, again, lots of different places where they've become very sophisticated on getting these tools. With ransomware, many ransomware attacks, particularly those that are sophisticated and criminal-based, they have 1-800 numbers. They have 1-800 numbers. So when you don't understand how to pay them in Bitcoin, you can call them up and they'll walk you through it. They'll walk you through it. Who's here from Colorado? State of Colorado Department of Transportation, February 2018. Sam ransomware attack took down the entire Department of Transportation in Colorado. 1,300 end-user computing devices and servers, their business application systems and financials and payroll were all locked up. Fortunately, they did have good practices around recovery. They didn't pay, but it took them weeks and weeks and weeks to get back up to business. You heard about what happened in Atlanta 2 weeks ago. County in Georgia paid $400,000 because they didn't have adequate backup disaster recovery. And so this is the new world of what's going on in the public sector. And again, what they're doing is they are locking up electronic records and business systems. Can you imagine that you're sitting there getting ready to have a major operation in a major hospital, and you find out that they've been the victim of ransomware, and all the health records and all the diagnostics and everything they need for you has now been compromised and is locked up. That's what happened in Great Britain. So we see more and more of this. So just our advocacy, I'll end with this. This is our 3 bold plays coming out of our last report for 2018. Part of it is, let's look at dedicated funding. We have dedicated funding for lots of risk reduction programs in the states. We don't have a universal one for cyber, so that's a challenge. We have to get over the state chief information security officer being Dr. No, because they are now, in some cases, probably to their detriment, maybe overreacting on some of the security controls because they're so concerned about this increasing levels of risk. So they have to really, things like innovation in artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, Internet of Things, all known as the Internet of Threats, they have to be actively involved in the discussions around this to make sure they're done in a secure way with the appropriate controls in place. And then finally, because of the cybersecurity challenges, both about delivering services and also about the retention of cybersecurity talent and be able to recruit and retain, we've highly suggested that states partner with the private sector in higher education. Some states are doing this already. They have active programs with internships, active programs with major universities located near the Capitol to be able to build in this and try to build more public-private partnerships around how to get more folks in the pipeline. And again, I bring up the private sector because what we're seeing, just like we're seeing in the freedom of information, in the FOIA business, more and more private sector firms delivering those services under contract on behalf of governments. We're seeing the same thing in cybersecurity. More and more states having to rely on managed cybersecurity services because they don't have the requisite skills and the funding to do that, so they're doing it under contract. And that's going to continue to increase. So I'm going to end with really talking about the forces of change, and I'm only going to cover a couple of these and then get into kind of what's going on in the exemption area and kind of the rationale behind some of the exemptions that we're seeing. And again, just to kind of describe what's going on. So let me pick out a couple of these because I think you'll then see these changes that have been taking place for certainly the last 4 or 5 years in state government and how this is going to continue to change. I don't see it abating at all. We're going to see more and more of these sourcing decisions that are being made, as well as higher adoption of cloud services. So just one data point. We have a lot of information about this, but I wanted you to see what is taking place in the states, and that's around the evolving business model of the state CIOs. The state CIOs in almost every state are a cost recovery organization. They sit in the center. They're the central IT organization, and they deliver services to all state agencies, predominantly in the executive branch, but some broader, some even to local governments, and some to higher education. But let's just take the executive branch, for example. So this is a very revealing, if you understand the history and background of this, revealing set of data where you're seeing where states going, where state CIOs say they're going to go in the next 3 years to deliver services. They're moving more towards outsourcing, again, using private sector firms. In some cases, not even within the state boundaries. They're moving to software as a service in the cloud, right? The cloud environment, delivering services with a scalable and effective cloud infrastructure, the principle of physicality doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Anybody in here use Gmail? Do you care? No, you want the service. You want a subscription, you want a service. Do you care where the compute environment is sitting? States used to care where their compute environment was because they had state-owned data centers. No state is building a new data center. No state is hiring more IT staff. So you look at two of those data points right there. 10 years ago, that was where the number one and number two direction states were going. Building new data centers, expanding and remediating their existing data center, and hiring more IT staff. Those were at the top of the list. They're now at the bottom of the list. So we've got inverse what's going on in the states. Where are states going? They're going more outsourcing, more managed services, more IT shared services, and more as a service model, software as a service, platform as a service. They're going to rely more and more on the private sector solution providers to deliver services that are necessary to state government. We now have 32 states where one firm essentially supports their .gov environment, their portal. Now, some of the components around it, the business models around that in terms of access to records is problematic because I think it brings up some of the cost issues. Yes?
All this outsourcing, is it just budgetary? Is that the reason why they're just outsourcing to private entities?
I think that is part of it. I think, and I'm going into that, I think the lack of capital as opposed to lack of budget. So lack of capital is a big issue. The inability to recruit and retain talent, so that's part of that forces of change, moving to cloud. The efficiency of that is important. I think, quite frankly, the security of the cloud environment is actually at the commercial side better than what states were doing. If you go back 5 years and I asked the question, what are the major challenges for cloud adoption? The number one answer would have been security. Today, when I ask about why you move into cloud, one of the top answers is because it's more secure. Again, because those companies are investing in, because they have business risk, they're investing in higher levels of security. When you think about the banking industry and the financial services industry, many of those companies have already moved to cloud, meaning commercial cloud. So I think we're going to see this. So again, here's the reason right there. I mean, I try to move forward quickly. Cost savings and efficiency, scalable. I think it's measured service. States have long been what we call the owner-operator model. owner-operator. States for 4 decades, they owned everything. It was in the state government campus, in the Capitol, and they operated. They wrote software, they developed programs, and so it was an owner-operator model. We're going to the CIO as broker model. Hybrid models today. We're many states today. We have several states, and in fact, their entire IT infrastructure and service portfolio is outsourced to the private sector. Yes?
Question part, but a couple of years ago, we had our legislature wanted to pass an exemption that allowed some of that outsourcing information to be confidential because of the idea that if someone knew who the security firm was that was protecting the data, that would create a security risk, right? And we really have difficulty with that exemption because we don't use the main vendors confidential. But I wonder what your opinion is of that. Is it a real risk to know who you have a contract with on that?
NASIO does not have an opinion on that. Yeah. I'm only going to talk about where we've issued an opinion or advisory. We haven't on that because, again, I guess my discussion here was, I would say if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. If you've seen one state, you've seen one state. So every state has a different culture, different legislative agenda, and so they all address that in a different way. And there's clearly some things that I would agree should not be available that would have been available pre. I was in the post 9/11. I was there, so I understood the rationale for some of the things that we did and decisions. Some of those things have now been retracted. It probably, at that point, overreaction to that event. But there are other things, and I was in charge of the enterprise architecture. We would publish our security domain, which included the security products that we were using to protect the environment, okay? We immediately removed all those because we were basically providing much more detail than we needed to. And many states have done that. Many states have retained that where they describe their security architecture, but is there any real value to actually saying we use this virus protection, we use this endpoint protection, we use this data loss protection. So listing the actual products being used, many states did that. I think you're seeing, so that's the example I would use is, so I would agree with that. On the managed outsource side, those are competitively bid contracts, so procurement will know who the award went to. So that's a bigger policy discussion. No. Yes?
Okay, there's something I don't understand. If I want to check the balance of my checking account, I go to my credit union and I have 3 tries to get my username and password correct. If I screw it up, if I mistype a letter or use lowercase when it should be uppercase, I'm booted off. I got to wait till normal business hours and call the credit union and get them to give me another chance. Why can't the government do something about people who are making millions of attempts a day to penetrate their system?
Yeah, because they have the same type of constraints, but again, they're using brute force capabilities. So they're not individuals that are doing this; these are bots. Okay, these bad guys are using sophisticated software and tools and algorithms to bust through this. And again, they're trying to look for network vulnerabilities. They're trying to look for a brand new server that just pops up with a new internet protocol, a new IP address. They're immediately looking at that configuration to make sure that somebody didn't leave the administrator password as password, and this has happened. So I'm saying most of these vulnerabilities have to do with human error on the government side or the third-party contractor side. So yeah, it's a different environment than simply you doing that. Most states have that capability, and most organizations are now moving to multi-factor authentication where you can recover your own password, right? Most large organizations are giving you that capability that you can go back and you can get that, you can get a code sent to your phone, text to your phone to approve who you are. But I think, again, authentication, authorization to those systems, that happens in state government as well. But it's not, they're using massive password cracking capabilities. They're not using it as an individual. Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned the word voting. It's on everybody's mind. I wonder if you could give us an update on how you think the states are doing in security and other regards in the voting area.
I'm going to mention that at the end, so let me get to the end. So yeah, you're jumping ahead on the story here, so I will get to that because I'm going to move now into some of the exemptions things. So cloud continue to grow. Cloud's going to continue to grow, and And there's without a doubt, because of, again, the flexibility, scalability, the cost. That's going to grow whether it's private, meaning it's run by the state CIO organization, or it's public, meaning it's provided by all the names you know and love that are doing cloud services that are, all of you are probably using those cloud services today, whether you know it or not. You know, the back-end environment is Amazon Web Services and Microsoft and Google. They're sitting behind that. This is one interesting artifact. I pulled one data that I thought would give you an indication of how things are changing. Again, this is evolutionary, I don't think revolutionary, but this is a thing that certainly if you think about the role of a CIO in a state as the chief executive for IT and the responsibility for infrastructure management and operations, they run the mainframe. We now have, actually this has increased, should be 20% now, so 10 states out of 50. We have 10 states where their mainframe is that not only do they not run it, it's not in their state. We have 5 states where their mainframe is now run in one location by a major provider because they've moved to a mainframe as a service. Again, owner-operator is beginning to dissolve here, and we now have states that are moving that. So where's the data? The data's in another state. And part of that is, again, cost effectiveness, efficiency, no capital to upgrade. They don't have the requisite skill sets. Those modern COBOL 74 programmers have long since retired, or they look like me, and that's not a good thing to have in state government, right? So they've got 2 people left, and they're the only ones that understand the payroll system, and it's 30 years old, and it's a legacy environment. So they're moving to CIOs. Their biggest aspiration is to try to modernize the IT environment and modernize their business process, so this is what they're doing. So they're moving to the mainframe being actually run by a commercial entity, and most of these are in another state. In fact, they all are. So I ask legislators, I speak to them a lot, I always ask them, I don't ask them where their kids are, I said, do you know where your mainframe is? And most of them don't, which is, you know, probably an optics thing that they don't quite understand. But this is, again, you look at the numbers here, 20% planning and considering. I know a couple of states that are already in the RFP process. So this is going to continue to grow. The question on the table for everybody is, does it really matter? As long as you can have access and reliability, you have 5 nines, you have uptime, that's what states want. And you have a highly secure environment that's managed. You can't transfer the risk to this third party. The state still has the risk. But again, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, this is driving that shift. This is just one example of what's taking place. Now, and I bring that up because you saw this with things like Next Request and Gov Delivery and Socrata. State and local governments are all moving to these. They're not developing their own online portals for public records. They are commercially available, viable, highly scalable. Most of those are what we call SaaS or cloud, software as a service, operating in the cloud. They can handle multiple clients. This is where the private sector is today. And this is where government is going, is moving slowly to that model. And it's going to, again, you're going to see it now. For the benefit of that, for many of us, particularly on my side, which is, again, the development and long-term life cycle, is that you have common platforms that are continuing to evolve and ask. You're going to have, again, comfortable because you're going to have the uniformity of a lot of those platforms, and they're going to get feedback from their customers, and they're going to provide more and more of that uniformity. And so they begin to configure their environment to be able to serve their government customers, whether it's federal, state, or local. That's just the reality. Yes?
Speaking on that front, is there something that you could say that maybe is a negative in terms of the moving towards more privatization in terms of open records portals? Is there a reason to think that more in-house IT staff support or development of these platforms in-house is advisable, or what's the flip side?
Yeah, there's the yin, and there's pros and cons to that. I mean, clearly you're talking about the loss of internal capacity in terms of the what I'll call the business knowledge, because you've done that. The reality is the constraints on the resources, and so you have to balance those out. We need to deliver this service. So every state, these are the conversations that happen internally. There's more and more contractors moving into the IT space in state government. That is certainly not ideal from the standpoint of the state CIO. They would prefer it not be that way, but they're under tremendous pressure to deliver cost-effective services for their agencies. And they would prefer to not think about porting their mainframe to a virtual environment and putting it, but again, the cost pressures, the effectiveness, the requirements to deliver. Mainframes generally are running these large entitlement programs that are critical to serve citizens. So they're running, Medicaid management information systems, they're running benefit systems, they're running TANF, aid to needy families, they're running SNAP, food stamp programs, UI, unemployment insurance programs. So these are all the critical base programs that many, many citizens expect to get delivered. The question is, do you want to say we can't afford to do that and it's down, or you say we have to deliver that? These again have to be available. So I think that is the conundrum that they're in, is recognizing that, but they don't like to lose the business knowledge. And so, I think what I'll say to you is you're not transferring the risk or responsibility. Government still has that, whether you privatize those services or not. The government's still on the hook, and they should understand that.
Just wondering, do you have any opinion on data breach notification laws at all? A lot of states are data breach notification. Yeah.
Yes, you should notify. Yeah, every state has data breach notification today. Some don't have what I would call holistic view or whole of state, where it only applies to the private sector. Yeah, clearly. I think any of the advocates would argue for robust data breach notification. The question, and again, the debate about every state is, what's the threshold? Is it above a certain level of records released? Is it some monetary issue? But clearly, citizens, consumers should be notified. The question for states is, do state government entities, are they included under the umbrella of that data breach notification? In a lot of states, they're not. It applies only to commercial. In California and other states, state agencies are. Yes, again, NASTA hasn't had a public proclamation, but again, they would support the fact that state governments need to be included in that notification. That's why so many of them today are getting cybersecurity liability insurance, because it doesn't cover the cost of the full remediation. What it does is cover the cost of data breach notification. If you've got to notify millions of citizens, you've got to get credit protection for them, which is, quite frankly, that's a debate as well, whether there's really any benefit to getting credit protection. But I think that's what they have to do. Yeah, so they have to do that. But again, that discussion, the obtaining cybersecurity liability insurance at all called the enterprise level, meaning the executive branch, that is part of the role of the state CIO. Many of them have been actively involved in that. The data breach issue is what I would call a line of business or an agency level issue. The state CIOs are not the custodians of those records. So if there's a data breach in unemployment insurance, that's the responsibility of the Department of Employment Services. And again, I'm not defending or disclaiming the role, but again, it's part of the statutory authority that's defined in state law about who's responsible for what. And so that's a challenge.
Doug,
yes,
if I could, we're
going to... We're out of time, I know.
No, I was going to say we can go about 5 minutes over for that. But I just want to ask you a real quick question, if you could address this as well. For a lot of the coalitions that we've heard feedback from, a couple things, and this goes back to the legislature, again, the concern of getting ahead of this, because we've seen some legislation introduced that would affect what we feel are as public record laws, but being caught up in this cybersecurity umbrella to start to become exemptions to that based on some kind of security going on there as well. Yeah. And so this idea of should we be looking at public information versus private public information, and literally states handling those things differently, and if they're doing that. And the other thing is, some of these private companies that are obtaining these public records and that are beginning to monetize them themselves for the public in terms of having to pay for them as well. And that doesn't seem to be the best way to go on the future, but that's where it's going.
Yeah, NASTA doesn't have any comments on the privatization and sale of records. But yes, we know it exists. But again, that's a business decision generally constituted between the agency of record, the custodial agency, and that private firm. The CIOs are not often involved in those conversations, and they're not delivering those services, but they certainly may be involved in, they're not involved in the decision phase, let's put it that way. They're often involved in the conversations around security things. So let me end with that conversation, which is what's going on, and you can certainly look at this publication. It doesn't specifically address the exemptions, but the growth and what's happening and why this continues to be a challenge and will continue to be a challenge because of the born digital way. So data today, particularly in the States, is coming in increasing numbers in an unstructured or a semi-structured format. becomes very difficult for states. It used to be pretty simple because it was a database format, it was fixed elements, fixed length. Now it's coming from all kinds of sources. Think about things like body-worn cameras. Digital video, no metadata, just these huge, massive amounts of terabytes of data, again, that organizations, particularly local governments, have to deal with. And again, the question on that is, when that become is it a public record? Yes. Is it open public record? Up for debate. I think that's the major debate within public organizations, is where does that transcend between being a public record and an open public record? And so that's the challenge here. These are some of the numbers just to look at the dramatic growth from our friends at COSA. And again, the long-term digital preservation is a problem. It's been a cost problem and a capital investment problem. And again, if you want access to these records, again, what are you seeing here? We've got 19 states that are now using a commercial, what I call off-premise, meaning they're not in state government, third-party cloud provider to store all or portions of their long-term digital records. And that, again, that's the reality. This company serves banking interests globally. They serve other financial and insurance companies. This is the trend. This is not a line of business that we can sustain. So we're going to go to the commercial sector under contract because we can hold them to contractual terms and obligations about migration and access. Again, you're going to see into that grow. It's grown pretty dramatically just in 3 or 4 years, states that are moving in that direction.
Yes.
Thanks, Doug. I really appreciate this presentation and the one you gave on open data a few years ago, and really like the work. It's been helpful to us. But now let me ask a hostile question. No, the CIOs are not the custodians, and I get that. They're not the interface there. But the design of the records and forms and how they're stored and how they're preserved and all that speaks so much to what you can extract out of it and how easy it is to extract out of it. This is especially true of state and local governments. But there are a lot of types of documents that we know going in are going to get asked for. So why wouldn't it be the CIO's responsibility, or does it need to be, is that something that has to come from the top down to help design it from the beginning with that in mind? We run into this with paper records and redactions, and why can't we be doing this on the front end? And why would it be the CIO's responsibility?
Great question, and quite frankly, in most states it is, from what I'll call the enterprise architecture perspective. So those states, and not all, that have a data architecture as part of that, and the majority of the states do, those are the conversations they're having, is what I'll call harmonizing how data is represented, how it's made available. Exactly, you're right. Those are the conversations they get into. They're trying to influence enterprise direction to make it very similar across the board in terms of how data is represented, how it's captured, moving to enterprise class systems so that agencies all have to use that same environment, so is a common user interface. So you're seeing that happen in a lot of states, right? But it's not, I think it's going to take years to overcome the silos of excellence within the lines of business. The CIOs, they're challenged to be able to manage that orchestra, so to speak, to conduct that orchestra of all those differences, to bring them together. And so an old axiom in architecture in the States is it's not about the kinds of numbers, but the numbers of kinds, right? That's your cost, that's your diversity, is the numbers of kinds. And so the same thing goes for data, and the same thing that states are working on is how do you reduce the diversity? We know today there's too much vocabulary, too much diversity, not enough what I will call interfaces to information and data exchange. NASCIO has been a long-time advocate of the National Information Exchange Model, which is the national, again, model to make data exchangeable from different sources. So you're exactly right. So that is part of the role of the state CIO, and they're certainly doing that if you look at some of the states that have long-term electronic working groups under their architecture. It's just, it seems to take a while to get to see the light. So let me end with this data that will probably not surprise you, because this is the point of this whole thing is, we're seeing this grow. We've seen it grow in the last several years. We now, from our friends at National Conference of State Legislators, I communicate with them pretty regularly about these topics. I have 27 states that have those provisions in law, and I've kind of broken them up in kind of these exemptions. and kind of the numbers. And again, the growth is really in this first one. The folks that have expressed exemptions around cybersecurity systems, procedures. And again, I think from a business rationale, I can't argue too much with the rationale behind it. I may argue with the language or how strident it is, how prescriptive it is, but I can't argue with the fact that the configuration of your endpoint, your devices you use, your security architecture, how your password construction, your password policy, all states that's available. You can go find out what guidance the CIO has given to agencies around passwords. Having access to the domain system where passwords are stored, clearly, these are things that I think you would not want to have changed. Have there been maybe some overzealous interpretations of this? Certainly. Again, I'm not going to defend all the states, and majority of the states have done this today across the board. They're doing it for homeland security and anti-terrorism purposes. And again, some things that were done post 9/11, we probably need to go back and revisit them and see, do they make any sense to do this today? All right, so I think that's a challenge for all of us, is having that kind of rational thought. Again, I'm not gonna certainly punt on this, but you have state legislators that are being influenced by outside forces around this, and we certainly are opposed to a lot of this, what I'll call extreme legislative reaction to some of this in terms of what's going on in the state environment. So we continue to support the open government platform, recognizing that things like election security is getting a lot of attention. Again, the CIOs are not responsible for, I got a lot of calls 2 years ago. The CIOs are not responsible for election security. You have chief election officials in each state, Secretary of State in most states. Their responsibility is protecting. Now, to that end, we have begun to collaborate with them over the last couple of years. There was a report put out by the Council of State Government back in December of 18 that we were involved in, and there are multiple other studies being done around how to improve election security, including National Governors Association has just launched a cybersecurity policy academy around election security, which is bringing together the CIOs, the governor's offices, the chief election officials in each state to address these issues, because there's clear challenges around this area that we have to address. So again, election security is definitely on our list. I don't know if we're going to put out a major research brief on that, but we're certainly collaborating with the requisite group. So again, I've exhausted my time. I'm in between you and the box lunches here. So
well,
that's
Doug, thank you very much for being here today. Somewhat frightening.
Yeah. One last thing, if I could, just from the standpoint of open government. Everything that we write, that we publish, all our webinars, our research briefs, our national studies, I turned off our member-only paywall about 14 years ago. Coming from government, I felt like as the National Association, the rising tide raises all boats, and we shouldn't be simply just speaking to the choir on this. So everything that you see that I talked about, you can go to the NASCIO.org website and you can download it. It's all available freely, PDF. You can watch our webinars. Multiple webinars on cybersecurity in the last 3 years. So if you're interested in more detail on that, for whatever reason, or want to see these national reports, I think we put out almost 12 studies on electronic records and digital preservation in the last 10 years or so. So this is something we will continue to talk about and try to educate our members on. So again, I want you to offer that, is that you can go see all that. We're as transparent as we possibly can be in that space. So I thank you all for your attention today, and I'm going to be here for at least probably another hour and a half or 2 hours. So I'll join you for lunch, and you can beat me up then. Thank you.
Thank you.